There's a scene at the very end of one of the most decorated films in modern cinema where a man stands alone at a dirt crossroads in the middle of nowhere, and he cannot decide which direction to take. The score swells, gentle, almost comforting, and the audience, for one brief second, feels a warm wave of relief, almost a smile of hope. But I need you to stop right now and look at that scene in a completely different way, because that is not the ending of a triumphant journey. That is a funeral scene. The funeral of a man who died a long time ago, and that nobody, not the filmmakers, not the audience, not the awards committees, ever had the courage to say out loud. Cast Away, released in 2000, is still sold to us as the definitive portrait of human resilience. The film that proves the human spirit is unbreakable, that no matter how alone, how lost, how far from civilization you are, there is always some inner strength capable of bringing you home. That is the comforting lie Hollywood has been selling for 25 years. The truth, the clinical truth, cold and documented in every choice this script makes, in every silence this film holds, is far more disturbing. Chuck Noland did not defeat the island. The island consumed him. The man who boarded that FedEx plane, in love, ambitious, addicted to his own stopwatch, full of plans, full of future. That man died in the crash, along with the burning wreckage scattered across the water. What survived, what crawled onto that white sand beach, was not Chuck Noland. It was a shell, an organism in shock that still breathed, still had a beating heart, but that had already lost forever. The thing that made him human, and the rescue, that moment of overwhelming emotion everyone watches with tears in their eyes, was not salvation. It was a sentence, the sentence of a broken man condemned to wander like a ghost through a world that kept spinning without him, that moved on without him, that buried him, literally, while he was still alive. Today, I'm going to take apart, scene by scene, point by point, that fantasy of triumph, and I'm going to show you the psychological horror film that was hiding underneath that hopeful soundtrack the entire time. Brace yourself, because this one is going to hurt, because deep down, all of us have already felt, in some small way, exactly what Chuck felt. The fear that if we vanished tomorrow, the world would simply keep turning, and no one would stop long enough to truly feel our absence. Before we go to the island, I need you to understand who Chuck Noland was before the fall. Because without understanding the man he was, you will never understand the walking corpse he became. Chuck was a systems engineer for FedEx, and that job is not a random screenwriting detail. It is the very core of this entire tragedy. He was not simply a man who worked with deadlines. He was, quite literally, a priest of time. His religion was the clock. His god was efficiency. We see it in the very first scene of the film, where he screams at his colleagues in Russia about the importance of every single second, about how time is the only thing that truly matters in the world, and how wasting time is the gravest sin a human being can commit. He carries that pocket watch, a gift from Kelly with her photograph inside, like a totem, a physical reminder that his entire life is structured around a countdown. Chuck lived inside an invisible prison, one he built for himself, where every minute had to be justified, every delay had to be corrected, every moment of existence had to serve a productive purpose. Psychologists call this identity fusion with social role, when your function in the world, your job, your usefulness within a system, becomes indistinguishable from your own sense of who you are. Chuck was not a man who worked at FedEx. Chuck was FedEx. And that is exactly why the island will not simply test his body. It will attack the very core of his identity. Because by taking away his watch, his deadlines, his system, his corporate purpose, the island is not taking away his comfort. It is taking away the only structure that kept him sane. Imagine, for a moment, tearing faith away from a priest, tearing art away from an artist. That is exactly the level of psychological violence we are about to witness. The plane goes down, and here we already find the first layer of horror the film disguises with narrative speed. That crash sequence is shot with deliberate sensory chaos, shaking cameras, water rushing in from every direction, total darkness. And that is not just a technical device to generate adrenaline. It is an almost perfect simulation of what clinical psychology calls a dissociative traumatic event, the kind of experience so brutal, so far beyond what the human brain can normally process, that the very sense of continuous reality shatters in that instant. Chuck wakes up on the beach, alone, and the first thing he does is vomit seawater. That is not a cosmetic detail. That is his body physically trying to expel an experience his mind cannot yet process. In the days that follow, we watch Chuck try to apply corporate logic to the island. He tries to make fire with efficiency, he tries to organize supplies, he tries to impose structure on chaos, and he fails repeatedly, humiliatingly. That failure is not just about physical survival. It is the first crack in the ego of a man who built his entire self-worth on the ability to control systems. The night he finally manages to make fire, he screams, he dances, he celebrates as if he had conquered the world. And it is easy to read that scene as triumph. But look closely at his face in that moment. There is an almost manic euphoria there. Wide eyes, uncontrolled laughter. That is not the healthy joy of a solved problem. That is the first visible symptom of a mind beginning to disconnect from shared reality, because there is no one left, absolutely no one, to witness or validate that achievement. He is alone with his own triumph, and being alone with your own triumph is just another form of being alone with your own madness. And it is exactly inside that vacuum, that deafening silence of a mind with no one left to share its existence with, that Wilson is born. And here, I need you to forget everything you have ever been told about this volleyball. Wilson is not an adorable mascot. Wilson is not a cute symbol of human creativity in the face of adversity. Wilson is a clinical diagnosis, materialized in front of your eyes on a movie screen, disguised as family-friendly sentiment. Let's look at the facts, with the coldness that science demands. A human being is a profoundly social creature. Our brains did not evolve to exist in total isolation. There are decades of documented studies on solitary confinement prisoners, on isolated polar explorers, on real-life castaways, and the same pattern repeats itself over and over. Severe prolonged social deprivation does not just produce sadness. It produces fragmentation of the personality. The brain, desperate for interaction, desperate for a mirror in which it can recognize itself as a social being, begins to manufacture that interaction where none exists. In clinical terms, this is called isolation-induced companion hallucination, and in more extreme cases, dissociative identity fracture. The film shows us the exact moment of that fracture, and it does it so subtly that most people watch it without ever grasping the severity of what they are seeing. Chuck, injured, blood dripping from his hand, accidentally smears that blood across the volleyball, and the bloodstain accidentally forms a face. He looks at that face, and something inside him breaks. He starts talking to the ball. And the ball, notice this, has a brand name printed on it, Wilson. And he simply adopts that commercial brand name as if it were the identity of an actual person. Sit with the cruel irony of that for a second. Chuck, a man who dedicated his entire life to serving a corporation, who measured his own self-worth in terms of logistical efficiency and delivery deadlines, now, at the peak of his mental disintegration, turns a mass-produced consumer product, a piece of plastic manufactured on an assembly line, into his last remaining social bond. It is as if the very capitalist structure that consumed his life before the crash was still present, disguised, embedded inside his psychosis. He could not escape the system even within his own fractured mind. From this point forward, Wilson stops being an object and becomes, for Chuck, a second inner voice, a second consciousness he projects outward. Because total solitude is psychologically unbearable for the human mind. Notice how carefully the film builds this. Chuck argues with Wilson. Chuck apologizes to Wilson after they fight. Chuck confesses his deepest fears to Wilson. At one point, he admits out loud to a volleyball that he had seriously considered hanging himself. This is the single most terrifying and most overlooked moment in the entire film. Chuck Noland attempted to plan his own suicide on that island, and the only thing that stopped him from completing that final act of despair was this personification, this artificial second consciousness his mind created, so he would not have to face that absolute darkness completely alone. Wilson is not a cute imaginary friend. Wilson is the survival mechanism of a mind that was seconds away from shutting itself down for good. Let's jump forward 4 years in the story and notice how Chuck himself changes, physically and behaviorally. His body grows alarmingly thin. His posture curves inward. The sharp focus his eyes once had is gone. And his dependency on Wilson does not fade with time. It deepens. This completely contradicts the surface-level narrative of triumph and resilience the film wants to sell you. If Chuck were genuinely growing stronger, more resilient, more adapted, his need for a projected second personality should, in theory, decrease. But the opposite happens. Wilson becomes more central, more indispensable as time goes on. Because the fracture in Chuck's mind was not healing, it was solidifying. He was not recovering from the initial trauma. He was permanently adapting to a new, fragmented psychic structure, one where part of his consciousness lived inside himself, and another part lived projected outward onto a sun-bleached volleyball. And then comes the raft escape, and with it, the single most psychologically devastating scene in the entire film, disguised once again as pure action and adrenaline. A violent storm separates Wilson from Chuck in the middle of the open ocean. Wilson falls into the water and begins drifting away. And Chuck, exhausted, dehydrated, on the very edge of physical death, still swims desperately, screaming Wilson's name, trying to reach that ball through massive, crushing waves. He literally risks the very life he spent 4 years fighting desperately to preserve, just to try to recover an inanimate object. Stop and consider the psychological magnitude of that. A rational man in his right mind does not risk his own survival for a volleyball. But Chuck was no longer operating with a whole, integrated mind. He was operating with a fractured one, in which Wilson was not an object. He was a functional, irreplaceable part of Chuck's own identity. When he finally cannot reach Wilson, when he realizes the current has carried him too far away, and he gives up, floating there, alone, sobbing uncontrollably, calling out the name of an inanimate object in the middle of the Pacific Ocean. That is not a scene of grief for a volleyball. That is a scene of real-time psychological amputation. Chuck is not crying for Wilson. He is physically feeling the sensation of losing, once again, a piece of himself. The same sensation, echoed from the moment he lost Kelly, from the moment he lost his old life, from the moment he lost in that plane crash. The man he used to be. Wilson represented the last proof that Chuck was still capable of loving, of connecting, of feeling empathy for something outside of himself. And when Wilson disappears, that capacity, that last spark of shared humanity, goes out with him in the waves. If you are feeling a weight in your chest right now, if this analysis is touching something deeper than just a movie, I need you to do 2 simple things before we keep going. Hit that like button and subscribe here on Fractured Plot. Because this way of looking at the stories Hollywood tells us is exactly why this channel exists. And leave a comment below. Honestly, have you always seen Cast Away as a story of triumph? Or did some part of you always sense something darker hiding underneath? Now, let's keep going. Because the most painful part of this analysis is still ahead. Chuck is rescued. And here, the lie of the happy ending narrative reaches its most cynical, most disturbing peak. The rescue scene, shot with all of Hollywood's grandeur, ships, spotlights, a triumphant score swelling in crescendo, conditions us to feel relief, to feel like the nightmare is finally over. But I want you to watch Chuck's face during that rescue. He does not smile with relief. He stares at the horizon with an empty expression, almost unable to process what is happening. Because for his mind, fractured and rebuilt entirely around isolated survival, rescue does not represent freedom. It represents the abrupt, violent invasion of a reality he no longer knows how to inhabit. And then comes the corporate banquet scene, perhaps the most cruelly ironic scene in the entire film, and the most underanalyzed of all. Chuck returns to FedEx headquarters and is greeted with applause, press flashbulbs, emotional speeches, champagne glasses raised in his honor. On the surface, this looks like a warm celebration of a beloved employee who survived against all odds. But look at the structure of this scene through the clinical eyes of someone who understands how corporations operate. That is not a celebration of Chuck Noland's life as a human being. It is a marketing celebration. Overnight, Chuck became the greatest advertising case study FedEx could ever have dreamed of. A man who spent 4 years on a deserted island and whose final act, before nearly dying of exhaustion on that raft, was to recover a company package he never delivered and hand-deliver it intact to its original recipient years later. This is not a coincidence in the script. It is the darkest, most central point of the film's entire message, and most people watch it without ever noticing the horror carved into it. Let's look closely at that package because, on its own, it is the most brutal metaphor ever put on screen about the relationship between a human being and the capitalist system he serves. That package, decorated with hand-painted wings, stayed beside Chuck for 4 entire years of absolute isolation. He never opened it, even while starving, desperate, with absolutely no witness who could ever judge him for breaking that seal. He preserved that object with an almost religious discipline because that package represented the last fragment of his former purpose, his former value system, the only identity he could still recognize as his own. When he finally delivers the package to the door of an isolated farmhouse in Texas, the owner is not even home. Chuck leaves a simple note saying that package saved his life and walks away with no fanfare, no recognition, no one left to witness that gesture. And that is exactly where the script, almost confessionally, reveals the true message hiding beneath the entire journey. Chuck did not survive that island because of abstract hope, or because of some distant romantic love, or because of faith in any god. He survived because, in an absolute vacuum of meaning, the only fragment of purpose he could hold on to was a corporate obligation, the duty to deliver a package. This is not an uplifting message about the strength of the human spirit. It is a terrifying portrait of how the capitalist system can colonize even the survival instinct of an isolated human being, to the point of literally replacing the meaning of life with a shipping obligation. And while Chuck was suffering this silent existential collapse, what was the company he served with religious devotion doing? They were throwing a party, they were toasting champagne, they were taking photographs. The systemic coldness revealed in this scene is almost clinical in its horror if you stop to dissect it. Chuck Noland's life, his sanity, his soul were, in practice, treated exactly the same way any lost package is treated inside a logistics center. He disappeared from the system, was registered as a loss, and when he reappeared, he was reintegrated into the flow with protocol-level enthusiasm, not because anyone felt genuine empathy for his suffering, but because his return story generated advertising value. This is the practical, brutal definition of corporate alienation. The moment a human being, with all his emotional complexity, all his trauma, all his psychological fracture, is reduced to a unit of value inside a larger system that has no capacity and no genuine interest in recognizing his suffering as something real. Notice, too, the speech Chuck gives to his friend Stan later in the film, sitting at the kitchen table, staring into empty space. He says he knows what he has to do now. Keep breathing, because tomorrow the sun will rise, and who knows what the tide will bring in. On the surface, this reads as an uplifting line about hope and resilience. But listen to the tone of his voice in that scene. There is no enthusiasm there. There is no life there. There is exhaustion. There is the hollow voice of a man who has learned that the only philosophy left, once everything you loved has been destroyed, is to simply keep existing, mechanically, one day at a time, without expecting anything truly meaningful from existence anymore. That is not wisdom. That is surrender disguised as wisdom. It is exactly the kind of language mental health professionals recognize in patients who have gone through a grief so profound or a trauma so devastating that the only surviving psychological survival strategy left is to reduce existence to its bare functional minimum. Breathe, wait for the sun, expect nothing more than that. And now we arrive, finally, at the deepest and quietest wound in the entire film. Kelly, the woman Chuck loved, whose photograph he carried inside that pocket watch like a sacred talisman through the darkest 4 years of his existence. The woman he mentioned to Wilson in his most desperate moments as his one true reason to keep trying to survive. Kelly believed he was dead. She cried for him. She buried him symbolically. She rebuilt her life. She married another man. She had a daughter. Years of genuine grief, processed, worked through with all the emotional legitimacy any human being has the right to seek after losing someone they love. And then Chuck shows up at her door. Alive? This should be the single most glorious, most emotional moment in the entire film if we were actually watching a story of triumph and a happy ending. But what the script actually gives us, with a brutal honesty the score desperately tries to disguise, is one of the most devastating reunion scenes ever filmed. Kelly is married. Kelly has a small daughter who is not Chuck's. Kelly genuinely loves both Chuck and her current husband in an emotional configuration impossible to resolve without someone suffering deeply. And Chuck, standing under that pouring rain in her garage, realizes in real time, right in front of the camera, the final definitive horror of his situation. He did not come home. He came back to a place that looks like his old home, populated by people he recognizes, in a city he recognizes, but the specific life he left behind, the specific life he was fighting to survive for, simply does not exist anymore. It was replaced, reorganized, moved on without him. In exactly the same cold, systematic way, FedEx reorganized its logistics without him. The entire world operated on the assumption that Chuck Noland was dead and completely restructured itself around that absence. And when he comes back, alive, he discovers there is no longer an empty space waiting to be filled again. The space closed, life moved on, scarred over, and the scar that formed over his absence no longer has a shape compatible with his physical return. This is isolation in a form even crueler than the island. On the island, Chuck was physically alone, but psychologically he still had a clear purpose. Crystalline, brutal in its simplicity. Survive, come home, find Kelly again. Now, surrounded by civilization, surrounded by people, technically surrounded by everything he spent 4 years desperately trying to reclaim, he is more isolated than ever. Because now he exists in a vacuum with no purpose left at all. The island had a clear narrative of survival. Civilization, for Chuck, has no narrative left. He is a ghost wandering through familiar scenery, recognizing everything, belonging to nothing. Kelly tells him in tears under that rain that he is the most important thing that ever happened to her life. And even so, she cannot stay with him. Two devastating truths existing at the exact same time with absolutely no possible resolution. This is exactly the kind of emotional paradox clinical psychology associates with some of the deepest, most enduring cases of complicated grief, because there is no clear path to healing when the person you lost is physically present, alive, right in front of you, yet emotionally and circumstantially unreachable forever. And so, we arrive at the final scene, the empty road, the crossroads in the middle of rural Texas, the scene that most film critics, for 25 years, have insisted on reading as an optimistic metaphor about infinite possibilities and new beginnings. I need you to look at this scene with the same clinical eye we have built throughout this entire analysis. Because this is not a scene about possibility. It is a scene about absolute emptiness. Chuck has just delivered the last package, the one with the hand-painted wings, the final remaining fragment of his old life's purpose. He is standing on a dirt road, literally in the middle of nowhere, surrounded by dry plains stretching as far as the eye can see. And he does not know which direction to take. A woman pulls over, asks if he is lost, and offers directions to different towns in different directions. He thanks her politely, and she drives off. And Chuck stands there, alone, slowly turning, looking down each possible road, as if he were genuinely trying to figure out which path to take. But notice this carefully. At no point in this scene is there any indication that anything specific is waiting for him in any of those directions. He no longer has Kelly waiting. He no longer has a job waiting with the same meaning it once held. He no longer has Wilson. He no longer even has the island, which, as perverse as it sounds, still offered him clarity of purpose. For the first time in his entire journey, he is completely free of any structure, any system, any clock dictating what he must do next. And it is precisely that absolute freedom that reveals itself as the final, quietest horror of the entire story, because freedom without purpose is not liberation. It is existential abandonment. Chuck survived the physical shipwreck on that island, but he never survived the psychological shipwreck of discovering that the world, the corporation, and even the love of his life all moved on perfectly fine without him. He is literally a man with no place left in the world. The island no longer wants him, and civilization no longer knows what to do with him. He has become, in the most literal and most desolate sense of the phrase, an alien on his own planet. Someone who recognizes every detail around him, but genuinely belongs to none of it. The camera slowly rises, revealing all four roads stretching out in opposite directions, forming a cross carved into the dry earth. And that visual composition is not accidental. It is the most honest possible geometric representation of Chuck Noland's psychological state in that exact moment. A man crucified, not by nails or wood, but by the total absence of any path left that still makes sense to walk down. The film ends there, without ever showing us which direction he chooses. And for decades, this has been sold as an open, hopeful ending, full of poetic possibility. But the harder truth, the truth this entire analysis set out to reveal from the very first second, is that it does not matter which direction Chuck chooses after that road, because the man making that choice is no longer the same man who boarded that FedEx plane all those years ago. That man died in the crash. That man died slowly, day after day, in the solitude of that island. That man died for good, silently in Kelly's garage, standing in the rain, the moment he realized there was no way back to the life he spent 4 years desperately fighting to reclaim. What remains, standing at that crossroads, is only a ghost, a survivor with no purpose, an employee with no function, a lover with no beloved, a man with no place. And maybe that is exactly why this final scene haunts us in a way most Hollywood happy endings never could, because it confronts us, without ever saying it out loud, with one of the deepest, most universal fears of the human condition. The fear that if we disappeared tomorrow, the entire world would simply keep spinning, reorganize itself around our absence, and that if we ever came back, we would find there is no specific space left waiting exclusively for us. Think about how many people, in real life, go through a quieter, less cinematic version of this exact same tragedy. People who drift away for years because of illness, because of work, for any reason that isolates them from the normal flow of the relationships they once built, and who, upon returning, discover their friends built new routines, their family reorganized around other priorities. Their job was already filled by someone else. The very space they used to occupy in the world simply closed over, like skin scarring over an old wound. Chuck Noland is the extreme, amplified to an unbearable degree, version of that everyday, entirely universal fear. And that is exactly why this story, even disguised as a survival adventure, echoes so deeply within us. Because it is not really about an island. It is about the fragility of the place each one of us occupies in the lives of the people we love, and about how quietly that place can be redistributed, without warning, without any intentional cruelty, simply through the unstoppable continuity of time. A time that keeps moving forward even after we stop moving with it. Cast Away was never, and should never have been, celebrated as a film about triumph. It is a clinical, meticulous, devastating portrait of dissociation, psychological fragmentation, corporate alienation, and the impossible task of rebuilding an identity after everything that once held it together has been torn out by the root. Chuck Noland did not defeat the island. The island won. It simply gently returned to the world the psychological remains of a man who was once whole and who now walks forward, forever fragmented, forever incomplete, forever alone, even surrounded by civilization, even surrounded by familiar faces, even standing right in the middle of a crossroads full of possible directions, with absolutely no real, true, definitive place left to call home. If this analysis has completely changed the way you are going to watch Cast Away from now on, this is exactly the kind of work we do here, week after week, taking apart the stories you thought you knew, revealing the psychological horror hiding underneath an inspiring surface. So hit that like button one more time, and if you have not subscribed to Fractured Plot yet, Now is the moment. And tell me down in the comments, honestly. After everything we broke down today, do you still see the ending of Castaway as hopeful? Or can you finally see the silent funeral that was always hiding there, disguised as an emotional film score? See you in the next analysis, where we take apart another classic you thought you already knew far too well.